Hello and welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share stories where people believe they encountered a Sasquatch. These stories include a man whose daughter saw something in the woods while on a camping trip, a woman who had a positive encounter with what she believed to be a Sasquatch, and a man who could have been followed by the Sykesville Monster. But first, we start with a story from a young man who might have been close to becoming a missing 411 victim. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Nevada, where a man had a strange experience while on a camping trip in the eastern part of the state. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that he had been to the campgrounds before, but he and his girlfriend had reached a point in their outdoor adventures where they liked to rough it, as he says, and tried to find a spot out in the middle of nowhere with no one else around. When they go out on their camping trips, they do multiple day what he refers to as overlanding 4x4 style, and they stay in a different place every night where most people usually don't go. Their encounter took place on a 5-day trip in 2019 over the 4th of July weekend. He says this night, the first night of their trip, he had some of the weirdest experiences he has ever had while camping. He goes on to say he didn't realize just how weird it was until he got home from this particular trip, and he has been camping for more than 30 years. During previous trips to the area, he had found a spot that was a couple of miles away from the campground he committed to memory. It was off a main dirt road and not hard for him to find. This is where he and his girlfriend set up camp. He always took his dog with him when camping, and usually the dog would go out and explore, but on this day she remained close to them. The OP just figured she didn't feel well due to their 3-hour trip in the car and dismissed it as that. Their day continued without incident until the sun set, and they built a fire, cooked some burgers, and started watching the stars. This continued until about 9 p.m., and that's when weird things began to happen. A whooping noise unlike anything the OP had heard before started in the woods around them. He says it had to have been no more than 100 yards away, and his first thought was that it was an elk. However, elk didn't make this particular sound, and he figured it was just an animal he had never heard before. This continued for about 10 minutes before they heard a loud bang that the OP describes as sounding like a gunshot from a nearby hunter. The spot where they were camping is near an area where people like to hunt. Except it wasn't hunting season, and when it was, hunting was only allowed during the day. Plus, even though it sounded like a gunshot at first, the OP knew, due to his experience with firearms, that it wasn't a shot. He says it sounded like someone had taken a sledgehammer and hit a tin roof or metal sheet approximately 100 yards from where they were. Being that he had a vast knowledge of the area, he knew there weren't any structures for a few miles, and this knowledge began to freak him out a bit. His girlfriend was oblivious to what he was piecing together as she sat by the fire, not worried at all. However, the OP and his dog were on high alert by this point. Not long after he heard the bang, he started seeing a light a good ways into the woods behind his girlfriend. He noticed it out of the corner of his eye, but when he looked in that direction, it was gone. Anytime he looked directly at the light, it vanished, but when he looked straight ahead, he could see it in his periphery. He told his girlfriend to look in the direction of the light, but when she did, it vanished. When she looked at the fire, the OP could see it in the distance. He describes the light as blurry and white with no discernible shape. When they were ready for bed, they settled into his Jeep and locked themselves inside. They had no further incident that night or for the rest of the trip. When they woke up the next morning, even the dog was in a better mood and acting normal. The OP even walked into the forest where he had seen the strange light the night before and estimates that it was about 8 feet off the ground. The ground did not look disturbed in the area where the light had been seen. He was left perplexed by the whole ordeal. However, when they got home is when the OP and his girlfriend realized just how eerie and creepy their situation really was. The OP is a big fan of the missing 411 stories and wanted to watch the movie based on them called The Hunted. As he and his girlfriend were watching the movie, they heard audio recordings, and that's when he says his blood ran cold. It was the same exact noise they had heard during their trip, and even his girlfriend agreed. Being that he is a missing 411 fan, he is always cautious in the woods, especially if he has children with him. Based on the missing 411 map that documents where people go missing across the United States, the area where he was camping was not one of them. He ends his post saying that's the truth of the matter, that he was completely sober during his trip, and he has been camping since without incident. He is still trying to wrap his mind around what happened that night. The whooping in this story definitely makes me think Sasquatch, as this noise is most closely associated with this cryptid. As for the banging noise and the way the OP described it as sounding like a sledgehammer hitting metal, that's a bit of a new one for me. But knocking and slamming noises like this often pop up in Sasquatch encounters. As for the weird light he saw while sitting at camp, my first thought was that it could have been eye shine. The height he describes it as being when he walked out to the spot the next day fits with a Sasquatch. Perhaps it could have seen him turning to look and would duck behind a tree when he did. But for it to be blurry and indistinguishable kind of pokes a hole into my theory that it could have been eye shine. Just a thought I had while reading this one. I also find it very interesting that he mentions missing 411, as there are many theories that link missing 411 cases and cryptids. In fact, there is a story where a boy disappeared and hikers coming down from a mountain saw what looked like a big hairy animal running on two legs with what looked like a boy thrown over his shoulder. If you're interested, it is the mysterious disappearance of Dennis Martin. But for the OP to be watching the movie about missing 411 cases, hearing the audio recordings, and recognizing them to be the same exact things he and his girlfriend experienced while on their trip would be nothing short of spine-chilling. It really makes me wonder about these people who disappear during the missing 411 stories and what exactly takes them. They are baffling to say the least. But in this case, I'm just glad that the OP and his girlfriend didn't have any other experiences or encounters during the rest of their trip, and that what happened didn't rob them of something that they love to do, like what happens in many of the stories I hear and cover on this channel. Hopefully he never runs into anything like that again. What do you think about this one? Was it a Sasquatch? And do you think the OP was almost a missing 411 case? The next story comes from a poster whose daughter saw something strange in the forest one day while they were on a camping trip. His daughter was 7 or 8 years old at the time of the event. He does not say where exactly his story takes place. During their camping trip, the original poster sent his daughter to the tree line to pour out some pickle juice. The tree line was no more than 50 feet from their camp, and he kept an eye on her the entire time. When his daughter reached the trees, the OP saw her stiffen as if something in the forest startled her. The OP immediately stood up and asked her if she was okay. She responded by saying that someone was walking within the trees. He walked over to his daughter and searched the trees but saw no one. He asked his daughter where the someone was, and she pointed to a spot, saying they had run from behind one tree to another. He then asked her to describe the person, and she said he was bigger than him. He points out here that he is 6 feet tall and 300 pounds, saying the fact that whoever or whatever was out there was bigger than him was concerning. He asked his daughter what they were wearing, and instead of describing clothing, his daughter just said that she saw brown and black with some white. The OP walked into the woods a little ways and still did not see or hear anything. It was in that moment that it dawned on him that his daughter may have just seen a Sasquatch. Upon mentioning this to her, he says he could not stop her from whooping and knocking on trees for the remainder of the weekend they were there. His daughter, who was 15 years old at the time of his posting his story, says she does not remember the small details about that day, but what made the biggest impression on her was the size of the thing she saw in the forest. Usually when I hear a story about a child seeing a cryptid, they are usually scared to death, so the fact that OP's daughter not only wasn't scared, but tried to whoop and knock on trees for the rest of the weekend is a good thing. Even better considering that nothing else happened on their trip. Sometimes when people are out camping, these creatures, Sasquatch and the like, take a particular interest in humans there and stick around their campsite, even sometimes running them off in the middle of their trip. I'm thinking this creature, whatever it was the daughter saw, was just passing through and she happened to catch a glimpse of it. Another thing I want to mention is that the daughter even now distinctly remembers the size of the thing she saw in the forest. This is what makes me think this thing was a cryptid. I mean, it could have been a person, but based on the size and the fact she described its color rather than the clothes, makes me think it was something covered in fur. Being that there is not a definitive description of this thing, I can't say for sure it was a Sasquatch. But it does certainly seem that way though. What do you think the OP's daughter saw that day? In my time narrating stories for this channel, I have seen some comments here and there asking for positive encounters with cryptids, and it just so happens that I came across a story about a positive encounter with a Sasquatch. I've noticed with Sasquatch that there seem to be more positive interaction stories than with any other cryptid. Some of them seem to be downright evil, while others are more interested in us and even interact with us, sometimes with a family for generations, as I've heard before. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend trying to cultivate a relationship with any cryptid because I've heard way too many stories where people are gifting back and forth with Sasquatches, everything seems fine, sometimes even for years on end. Then they stop and bad things begin to happen. Then there are the stories where they actually help people, especially children. There is a wide range of stories when it comes to this particular type of cryptid, and it just makes them that much more fascinating. But anyway, I've rambled on enough, so let's get into this positive encounter. This encounter comes from a poster who saw someone commenting asking about positive encounters. So she decided to share her experience that happened more than 20 years ago. She does not say where exactly her story takes place, just that she had just graduated from high school at the time and was running traps during the winter to make some extra money because she was pregnant. The creek where she was trapping had a history of being quite strange, according to her father. They would often walk the creek together, collecting arrowheads and looking for what Shawnee relics they could find. During their walks along the creek, he would tell her stories about the Shawnee Native American tribe, including their history and folklore. It became a sentimental spot for her because of the time spent there with her father, and when she started trapping there, her father told her to have respect for the wildlife. This meant not littering, killing humanely, and don't kill anything that is unnecessary. The reason she shares all of this is to provide some context for why she did what she did. While walking the creek, about once a week, she says, she would hear whistling, but it was unlike that of a human. Instead, it would happen in random patterns. This was accompanied by a pungent stench that stunk like sulfur and rotting eggs. When she told her father, he said it was most likely either a Sasquatch or a skunk ape, and there had been sightings in the area for as long as he could remember. Another time, she was out and scanning down the creek to see if there were any coyotes or foxes in her traps to save her from walking all the way to them if nothing was there. As she looked through her binoculars, she saw a medium-sized tree swaying dramatically, as she puts it, just inside the tree line. Curious, she started heading down that way with her .22 ready for a bobcat or any other medium-sized animal that might be down there. When she got about 3/4 of the way there, the tree stopped swaying and she could hear two beings start whistling and whooping farther into the forest. Continuing up the creek, she noticed that the sounds always stayed behind her and at a distance, not stopping the entire time she was out there. One day, an oil fracking company bought most of the land where the OP trapped, but they still gave her permission to continue her work there. The company would go on to have a few accidents that resulted in the contamination of the water. Unfortunately, this would lead to her finding dead animals such as beavers, muskrats, and raccoons floating down the creek every time she went out there. This, along with the company installing their rigs and clearing out some of the forest, is when things began to turn aggressive. She returned to the creek one day to find all of her traps destroyed. They had been bent, beaten, and broken, with the animals in them having been removed, sometimes with a gory sight left behind. But this is when things in her story turned positive. For the following few months, she would bring fruit such as apples and pears along with meat from the animal she had skinned and place the items in a basket in the forest, hoping to placate whatever was out there that had taken its aggression out on her traps and the animals in them. The baskets would sometimes disappear, and within a day or two, everything she left would be taken. One day when she went out to where she had left the baskets, there was an arrangement of about 100 sticks stacked up neatly along with 20 or so acorns and an antler from a deer. This made her happy. She ends her post by saying she hopes she helped whatever was out there during a difficult time, and being that she never physically saw anything or found tracks, can't rule out the possibility that it wasn't a Sasquatch or skunk ape. Her gifting with the unknown creature or creatures continued over the course of 2 winter seasons, and she found it to be a very positive experience, saying she isn't sure why people are afraid of them. She just hopes she was able to help them. To her last point about not knowing why people are afraid of them, there are many stories where these creatures are aggressive towards humans. I know she had a positive experience with whatever was out there, but this isn't usually the case with the stories I come across and hear. Actually, I'd be willing to say that most of the stories are negative and people have a good reason to be wary and afraid. With what she said though, I know there are stories like this out there where people have positive experiences with the Sasquatches they come across, whether it be on their land or out in the forest. Even still, I wouldn't recommend trying to interact with these beings no matter how positive they seem to be. As for what she came across and gifted with, I do believe it was a Sasquatch or more than one. The behaviors she describes in her story definitely point to this being the case, as whooping, whistling, tree swaying aggressively, and gifting are all signs of a Sasquatch. These are the most common details in stories recounting encounters with them. But given that she never physically saw anything, I can't say for certain that's what was out there with her. The evidence, though, certainly points to this being the case. What do you think she heard out there and eventually began gifting with? Would you have done the same thing? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who thinks he had a run-in with the Sykesville Monster. The Sykesville Monster is said to be a Sasquatch-like creature seen in Sykesville, Maryland, with many reports from eyewitnesses telling of the creature exhibiting certain behaviors toward them that will be detailed in this story. The original poster is in his 70s now, and his encounter took place in either 1969 or 70, but he still vividly remembers what happened. During that time, he was going through some traumatizing events in his life and needed to get away to get his mind right, according to him. To do this, he went and stayed at his mountain cabin for about 8 to 9 months outside of Frederick, Maryland. The OP had been staying there for about a month before things started to happen. It all started when a lost dog showed up at his cabin, a female beagle he says was sweet that he took in. Then, a couple of months into his stay, he started feeling as if there was a presence around the cabin. This included the sensation of being watched and, on many occasions, feeling like someone was looking into the cabin, watching him and the dog. This would eventually lead to him thinking he was being followed when visiting his neighbors he knew, who were somewhat nearby. He says he felt like whatever was out there would wait for him at night after leaving his friend's home and following him closely in the woods all the way back to his cabin. Whatever was there was so close he could hear its footsteps while walking in the dark the half-mile back to his cabin. When he would pick up his pace, so would the footsteps within the trees following him. This not only happened to the OP, but also to his brother and friends who visited him. Even though he was spooked by this, he says that while at night when this thing was around his cabin, he was never afraid or got the feeling that whatever was out there was malevolent in any way. At least, he says, when it first started happening. During his time at the cabin, the OP spent a lot of time exploring the forest around the area. Close to him was a state park and the Frederick Municipal Forest, which spanned many miles. The area of western Maryland where he was staying was nothing more than open country as opposed to now being well developed. As he hiked through the woods with his dog, he found campsites that looked to have been recently occupied. There were traces of fires and an old abandoned building with areas in the corners that appeared as if someone had been sleeping there. He found garbage, food, drinks, paper, and other things of the sort. He suspects that it could have been hunters, but the spots he saw didn't have any organization about them that would suggest it was people using them, especially that of experienced hunters. It wasn't until his final month staying at the cabin that the activity around him intensified, almost, says the OP, as if whatever was out there knew he would be leaving soon. Laying on the ground at the bottom of the steps leading up to the front porch, he would find small dead animals. The front porch was small and screened in, with a light door and a spotlight that lit up the long front yard with woods on either side. There were a lot of mornings when the OP would find small birds, a squirrel, a rabbit, and even a weasel. He says it was almost like they were offerings, and that he had to get them up before the dog attempted to eat them. This continued for several weeks. Then there came a night when he was awoken by something outside that sounded like it was on the front porch. He got up to find the hound dog standing at the front door, fixed rigid where she stood in a perfect point position. He notes here that the dog had never learned how to sit or stay, but there she was standing there pointing, shaking in fear. However, she never barked as he heard the porch door slam and something walk down the steps. He went and turned on the spotlight but saw nothing out there. He walked out onto the porch thinking that whatever had been there was trying to get in the front door. He continued to stay in at night, and as he did, the gifts left at the bottom of the stairs got bigger and bigger. There were large birds, a possum, a woodchuck, and the two final gifts were legs from either a horse or a cow. He says they were big, bloody, and one had even been skinned. Unfortunately, right before he left, the dog left, venturing off into the woods howling, following a scent. This was the second to last day, and the OP says he looked for her, even coming back in the weeks following his departure, but to no avail. He says she left as she came. I will say here that he doesn't think any harm befell the dog, and she just went on her way like she had when she entered his life. The OP would leave the cabin and return to his life in the DC suburbs of Maryland. Not long after his return to civilization, he picked up a copy of the Washington Post to find an article about the Sykesville Monster and recent encounters people had with it. The article described the monster as a tall, yeti-like creature covered in fur, bipedal, and would pick a family or person to give them, quote, attention. The OP quickly realized he wasn't the only one. The article went on to describe the sort of attention given by the creature as being the same types of things that happened to him. The Sykesville Monster would follow people at night, look inside their homes, and leave gifts. The details of the article left the OP shocked, and he says if he had seen something like that the night he turned on the spotlight, he would still be running. The OP goes on to give his own theory about who he thinks was actually the Sykesville Monster, saying that there is a psychiatric hospital close to Sykesville, Maryland, and believes it could have been an escaped patient living in the forests there. He believes the escaped patient would choose a family to, quote, adopt, and then exhibit the behaviors attributed to the Yeti-like creature. I'm not too sure about the OP's theory, given that pretty much everything he described as happening can be attributed to a Sasquatch, and there are a lot of stories with these exact details that back this up. These other stories I speak of have physical sightings and descriptions of the creatures as well. That's the only thing missing from this story. But being followed from just within the tree line is definitely something that Sasquatches do, but is also sometimes seen with other cryptids as well. However, the gifting in this story makes me think Sasquatch. Not only that, but a human would have to be pretty strong to dismember a horse or a cow and drag its full leg to the cabin, especially if they were living out in the forest on their own with no tools to do so. And we aren't sure the distance covered to do that, as he doesn't mention any farms close to where the cabin was. I believe he is right about the campsites, trash, and abandoned buildings belonging to either hunters or other people out there. And there very well could have been transients living in the forest around his cabin. And some of the odd things he experienced could be linked to people being out there, but there are just details about this story that point to it being a cryptid, and it makes me think Sasquatch. Especially the article detailing the exact things that happened to him, along with eyewitness reports from people having actually seen the creature. What do you think the OP experienced out there during his stay at the cabin? A Sasquatch, a person, or something else? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.